If you're listening to this and there's a strange pressure building behind your eyes, I need you to stay where you are. Don't step outside. Don't open a window. I don't care how calm it feels. I don't care how convincing the thought sounds. Please stay inside. I woke up before my alarm, not because of pain, but because something felt wrong. It wasn't a headache, not really. It felt more like my thoughts had weight, like every idea took effort to lift. When I sat up in bed, the room tilted slightly, as if my balance had to catch up with my mind. I remember pressing my fingers to my temples and waiting for the familiar throb of a migraine that never came. Instead, there was pressure, steady, patient, almost curious. I told myself it was dehydration or poor sleep or age finally catching up with me. That's what you say when you want a simple answer. I made coffee, turned on the radio, and listened to the morning host joke about seasonal head stuff going around town. I laughed, but it came out delayed, like my body wasn't fully synced with my reaction. Even then, I had the unsettling sense that something inside my head was listening too. By mid-morning, it was impossible to ignore how common the complaints were. At the corner store, the cashier rubbed her forehead and squinted at the register as if the numbers refused to stay still. Two customers ahead of me joked about feeling full of thoughts, then laughed again, louder than necessary. Outside, the sky was a clean, harmless blue, but looking at it made the pressure worsen, like my skull was being gently expanded from within. I lowered my gaze and focused on the tiled floor until the sensation eased. That should have scared me. Instead, I felt relieved, and that relief bothered me more than the pressure itself. It was the first time I noticed how easily discomfort could guide my behavior without asking permission. By afternoon, the town felt subdued, like everyone had collectively agreed to move slower. Conversations drifted off mid-sentence. People paused, frowned, then continued as if nothing had happened. I tried calling my daughter, but the ringing felt intrusive in my ear, amplified in a way sound shouldn't be. When she didn't answer, I told myself she was busy. That's another thing you tell yourself when you don't want to dig deeper. I sat at my kitchen table, notebook open, attempting to describe the sensation in my head. The words came out wrong. I crossed out pain, then pressure, then noise. None of them fit. What I felt wasn't hostile. It felt occupied, like a room that used to be empty had quietly filled while I wasn't looking. That evening, as the light outside softened and the shadows grew longer, I realized something else had changed. The idea of going outdoors lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Not as a plan, not even as a desire, more like a suggestion waiting to be accepted. I stood near the front door with my hand hovering inches from the handle, listening to my own breathing. The pressure eased slightly when I imagined stepping out and worsened when I stepped back. That's when I understood this wasn't random. Whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. It was learning how to use it. I went to the town hall because routine felt safer than staying alone with my thoughts. The planning meeting was supposed to be mundane: zoning updates, parking complaints, the kind of civic tedium that usually bored me into comfort. The room was full, yet strangely quiet, like everyone was conserving energy. Chairs scraped too loudly. Every cough felt amplified. When I sat down, the pressure in my head tightened, not painfully but insistently, as if it approved of me being there. People greeted one another and then stopped halfway through sentences, blinking like they'd forgotten the rest of the script. A man behind me whispered something about streetlights, then repeated the same sentence again, word for word, a minute later. No one reacted. A woman across the aisle laughed suddenly, too hard, too long, at something that hadn't been a joke. When she realized no one else was laughing, she covered her mouth, still smiling, eyes unfocused. We waited for the meeting to start, and waited. The organizer, a man known for punctuality, never appeared. Someone checked their phone and muttered that he'd sent a message earlier saying he had a bad head day. That phrase stuck with me. Another person echoed it minutes later, same wording, same shrug. Bad head day. It rippled through the room, repeated softly, like a reassurance we were trying to convince ourselves of. A few people suggested the flu. February always brought something around, they said. It made sense on the surface, and everyone nodded too quickly, too eagerly. But the nods didn't reach their eyes. I caught myself nodding as well, then stopped, unsettled by how automatic it felt. The pressure in my skull pulsed, not in rhythm with my heartbeat, but with the cadence of the room. As discussion sputtered to life without leadership, irritation crept in. Voices sharpened over trivial points. Someone snapped about noise levels, then apologized, then snapped again for the same reason. A woman near the front kept rubbing her temples and whispering, it'll pass," over and over as if reciting a charm. Each repetition made a few others murmur the phrase under their breath, not in agreement, but reflexively. When someone dropped a pen, another burst into laughter again, short, sharp, wrong, then looked confused by the sound they'd made. I felt an urge to laugh too, not because it was funny, but because the sound seemed to release pressure like cracking a window in a sealed room. I clenched my jaw and stayed quiet, afraid of what would happen if I let myself follow that impulse. Eventually, the meeting dissolved without anyone formally ending it. People drifted out in small clusters, conversations fading into murmurs. No one seemed surprised that it accomplished nothing. As I stood to leave, a man I barely knew caught my eye and said, "Fresh air will do us good," smiling like he'd offered a gift. The pressure in my head flared at the thought, sharp and bright, then softened again, almost pleased. I mumbled something non-committal and hurried toward the exit, suddenly aware that denial had taken on a shape, a sound, a shared rhythm. We weren't just sick, we were agreeing, silently, not to notice how wrong everything felt, and that agreement scared me more than the pressure ever could. That night, alone in my house, the silence felt crowded. I tried reading, then television, then just sitting with my eyes closed, but my thoughts kept drifting in directions I hadn't chosen. It wasn't like hearing a voice. There were no words, no commands. It felt more like my own ideas were being gently nudged, rearranged when I wasn't looking. I'd think about washing the dishes, and the thought would slide sideways into an image of my front door. I'd consider calling my daughter again, and instead I'd picture the street outside, empty and waiting. Each time I noticed the shift, a wave of pressure bloomed behind my eyes, not punishing, not angry, corrective. As if something were patiently steering me back onto a path I kept wandering from. I pressed my palms against my face and whispered my own name out loud just to hear it, just to remind myself I was still here. Sometime after midnight, I realized there was a pattern to it. Not a sound, not even a rhythm, but something emotional, like a tune remembered rather than heard. Certain thoughts carried a warmth, a sense of rightness, and those thoughts all leaned the same way. Outside, open space. Air. When I imagined staying inside, locking doors, closing curtains, the pressure thickened, became heavy and suffocating. When I imagined stepping out even briefly, the sensation eased, replaced by a strange calm that didn't feel earned. That terrified me. Relief shouldn't come with conditions. I stood in the hallway, caught between rooms, aware that the house itself felt like an obstacle now. The walls seemed closer than they had before. I laughed once, quietly, to test myself. The sound came out wrong, too flat, and the pressure surged in response, as if amused by the attempt. I took out a notebook then, an old one I'd used for grocery lists and phone numbers, and began to write. If I could see it on paper, maybe I could pin it down, give it edges. I described the pressure, the way it spread when I resisted certain thoughts. I wrote about the warmth that followed others. Halfway through a sentence, my pen stopped moving, my hand frozen in place while my mind drifted elsewhere. I couldn't remember what I'd been trying to say. When I looked back at the page, I saw words I didn't remember choosing, phrases that felt slightly off, like they'd been translated from another language. I scratched them out and started again, slower this time, saying each word in my head before writing it down. Even then, the pressure pulsed, a reminder that I was being watched, not from outside, but from within. The worst part wasn't the sensation itself. It was the uncertainty. I couldn't tell where my thoughts ended, and something else began. Every idea felt suspect. every urge questionable. When I thought, I should stay inside, was that me or was it fear? When I thought, it would feel better to step out for a moment, was that curiosity or coercion? I realized then that the true invasion wasn't the pressure or the melody or even the urge. It was doubt, the erosion of trust in my own mind. I closed the notebook and pushed it away, suddenly afraid that documenting this might make it stronger, give it more pathways to work through. As I sat there in the dim light, breathing slowly, one truth settled heavily over me. If this continued, there would come a moment when I wouldn't be able to tell which thoughts were mine anymore. And by the time that happened, it would already be too late. I noticed Mrs. Calder the next morning because she was smiling. That alone would have caught my attention. She lived 2 houses down from me and had spent most of the winter complaining about her joints, the cold, the way age made even simple pleasures exhausting. But there she was, standing at the edge of her front lawn while a light drizzle fell, her gray hair plastered to her temples, her gardening coat unbuttoned. She looked lighter somehow, like something had been taken off her shoulders. When she stepped off the porch and onto the wet grass, I felt the pressure in my head ease, just slightly, like a held breath being released. The sensation startled me so badly I grabbed the windowsill for support. Mrs. Calder tilted her head back, closed her eyes and laughed, not sharply or strangely, but softly, peacefully. It was the most content I'd ever seen her look. I remember thinking absurdly that she looked healthier than she had in years. She didn't hurry. That was the strangest part. There was no panic, no urgency, no sense that she was fleeing anything. She simply walked, slow and deliberate, down her driveway and toward the street, rain darkening the pavement beneath her shoes. A neighbor across the road called her name, asking if she was all right. She waved without turning around, her arm loose and carefree, like a child excusing themselves from a room. I watched until she reached the corner and disappeared from view, waiting for the pressure in my head to spike in warning or fear. It didn't. Instead, there was a warm, almost congratulatory sensation, as if something inside me approved of what I'd witnessed. That terrified me more than if I'd seen her collapse. I shut the curtains hard, heart racing, and told myself she'd just gone for a walk. People were allowed to go for walks. I repeated that thought until it almost sounded true. By afternoon, her absence had become noticeable. Someone mentioned it casually at the grocery store, then frowned as if they'd forgotten why they'd brought it up. A call went unanswered. Another neighbor said her phone went straight to voicemail. There was no alarm, no urgency, just a vague collective shrug. I walked past her house on my way back home and saw her front door slightly ajar. The radio inside was playing an old gardening show, cheerful voices discussing soil acidity and spring bulbs. The sound drifted out into the drizzle, uninterrupted. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at that open door, feeling the pressure in my head swell and pulse, urging me forward. Just step closer. Just look inside. The idea felt gentle, reasonable, almost kind. I took a step back instead, breathing through the discomfort, and hurried away. That night, Mrs. Calder was officially declared missing. The word felt too dramatic for how everyone said it, too heavy for the tone they used. There were no search parties, no police lights. Her house was locked up by evening, radio silenced, door closed. It was as if she'd never existed beyond a minor scheduling inconvenience. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about her smile, about the relief etched into her face as she stepped into the rain. The pressure in my skull throbbed in response, almost lovingly, and a thought surfaced, soft, unforced, dangerous. She isn't missing, it seemed to say. She just went where she was supposed to go. I clenched my eyes shut and whispered no into the darkness, but the word felt thin, fragile, like it might dissolve if I said it again. The call came just after midnight, when the house had settled into that uneasy quiet where every small sound feels deliberate. I almost didn't answer. The pressure in my head surged at the ringing, sharp and insistent, as if the phone itself were an intrusion. But when I saw Merrow's name on the screen, instinct won out over caution. Hearing her voice should have grounded me. It should have reminded me of normalcy, of family, of a world that still made sense. Instead, the moment she spoke, my stomach dropped. She sounded calm, too calm. Her words were evenly spaced, carefully pronounced as if she were reading from something just out of view. No warmth, no irritation, none of the small emotional inflections that made her voice hers. She asked how I was, but it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a line she was required to say before moving on. I asked her if she was feeling all right, if she'd had the same pressure, the same strange thoughts. There was a pause, longer than felt natural, and in that silence the pressure in my skull bloomed painfully. When she answered, she didn't respond to my concern. She told me she and her partner had sealed the doors and windows, boarded them, she said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Her tone never changed. She explained it the way someone might explain rearranging furniture. When I asked why, she said it was safer. Not felt safer, was safer. The distinction lodged in my chest like a splinter. As she spoke, I realized she hadn't asked me to come over. She hadn't suggested I wasn't alone. It was as if the idea of being together no longer occurred to her. Then she warned me not to answer knocks. Not from neighbors. Not from anyone. She said it slowly, deliberately, repeating herself when I didn't respond right away. Each repetition made the pressure ease slightly, like the sensation was rewarding compliance even when it wasn't mine. I wanted to argue, to tell her this was paranoia, that we needed help, not isolation. But something stopped me. Not fear, recognition. The words she was saying matched the thoughts I'd been struggling against all day. Stay inside. Don't open the door. The realization made my skin prickle. I asked her if she'd been outside. Another pause. When she answered, she said no, but there was something hollow about it, like the word had been selected for convenience rather than truth. Before I could ask anything else, she told me she had to go. No goodbye, no hesitation. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone. The house felt smaller after that, tighter, like it was closing in around me. I sat there for a long time, listening to my own breathing, replaying her voice in my head, and trying to find the daughter I knew hidden somewhere inside it. The pressure pulsed steadily, neither worsening nor easing, as if waiting. I realized then that trust was becoming dangerous. If even family could sound like that, if even love could be filtered, flattened, altered, then the rules were changing. And the most frightening part was that for the first time, isolation didn't feel like fear. It felt like the only thing keeping me intact. The storm rolled in without warning, no gradual build, no distant thunder to announce it. One moment the night was still, the next the rain was hammering the roof like it had been waiting its turn. The sound crawled straight into my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. The pressure I'd been managing all day surged, swelling until it felt like my head was being gently but relentlessly inflated from the inside. I staggered away from the window, hands pressed to my temples, breath coming fast and shallow. With every burst of rain against the glass, something inside me stirred, stretching, waking up. It wasn't angry. It wasn't violent, it felt pleased. I understood that instinctively, and the understanding made bile rise in my throat. I tried to distract myself with the television, but the voices sounded distant and unreal, as if they were coming from underwater. The rain, though, was sharp and immediate, each drop resonating with that strange internal pressure. It didn't take long to notice the pattern. Whenever the rain intensified, so did the sensation in my head. Whenever it eased, the pressure softened just enough to feel like mercy. I stood in the hallway listening, testing it, step closer to the door, relief, step away, pain. The realization hit me with a clarity that bordered on panic. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a conduit. The rain was carrying something, amplifying something already lodged inside me. I imagined the droplets striking the pavement outside, each impact sending a pulse upward into the air, into my skull. The thought made me dizzy, but it also made the pressure ease, as if the thing inside approved of me figuring it out. That terrified me more than ignorance ever could. Understanding felt like collaboration. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, and the pressure responded immediately, tightening until my vision blurred at the edges. I moved on instinct then, driven by a fear that finally outweighed the urge. I dragged furniture across the floor, the scraping loud and clumsy, and pushed it up against the front door. The pressure screamed in protest, sharp and punishing, but beneath it was something else: anticipation. As I nailed boards into place, hands shaking, I heard it for the first time, singing. Not loud, not clear, just a faint harmony woven into the sound of the rain. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, slipping through walls, through cracks, through thought itself. The melody wasn't sad or joyful, it was inviting. With every note, an image formed in my mind of stepping outside, of letting the rain soak through my clothes, of finally releasing the tension that had been building all day. My hands trembled harder as I worked, saliva pooling in my mouth as if my body were preparing to move without me. By the time I finished barricading the door, the urge was overwhelming. My entire body buzzed with it, a euphoric pull that promised relief, peace, belonging. The pressure in my head shifted, no longer painful but expansive, like something stretching its limbs after being confined too long. The singing grew clearer, more confident, threading itself through my thoughts. I pressed my back against the boarded door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, whispering no over and over like a prayer I didn't believe in. Outside, the rain continued its relentless rhythm, and I understood with sick certainty that this wasn't coincidence. The storm wasn't passing through, it had arrived for a reason. And whatever it was calling to, whatever it was waking up inside me, desperately wanted me to answer by stepping out into the open. I don't know how long I sat there before curiosity overpowered fear. The singing hadn't stopped, and neither had the pressure. It felt unbearable to stay ignorant any longer, as if not knowing was somehow worse than whatever waited beyond the curtains. I told myself I would only look for a second, just enough to confirm there was nothing there, just enough to quiet my mind. My hands shook as I stood and crossed the living room, each step accompanied by a pulse of relief, like I was being rewarded for moving closer. I peeled back the curtain no more than an inch, barely enough to let the streetlight spill in. The rain blurred everything at first, streaking the glass with silver lines, but then my eyes adjusted. What I saw didn't make sense in the way nightmares don't make sense. Not wrong exactly, just incompatible with reality. My breath caught, and the pressure in my skull surged, no longer painful but ecstatic. They were rising, slowly, unevenly, like balloons caught in a weak current. Neighbors I recognized drifted above the street, their bodies tilted at awkward angles, arms flailing as if trying to swim through the air. This wasn't gentle. This wasn't peaceful. Their legs kicked uselessly, shoes slipping off and tumbling back to the ground. Faces were twisted in terror, mouths open wide, but the screams didn't come out the way they should have. Instead, their jaws moved in perfect rhythm, opening and closing together, as if they were singing a song they hadn't chosen. The sound I heard wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside my head, louder than the rain, louder than my own heartbeat. I recognized the melody instantly. It was the same emotional pattern that had been guiding my thoughts all day, now given shape through their bodies. As they rose higher, the struggle seemed to intensify. One man clawed at the air as if gravity were something he could still negotiate with, his fingers curling around nothing. A woman spun slowly, her hair whipping around her face, eyes wide and unfocused. The higher they went, the more their movements synchronized, as if resistance were being ironed out of them. The melody in my head swelled, and with it came images, vast endless space above the clouds, something immense waiting there, attentive and patient. I couldn't see it, not really, but I felt it respond. The pressure in my skull expanded, blooming outward as though my thoughts were reaching up to meet something far beyond the sky. The realization struck me with nauseating clarity. They weren't being taken, they were being received. I tore the curtain closed and staggered backward, collapsing against the wall. My heart hammered wildly, but beneath the terror was something far worse. Longing. The image of their ascent replayed in my mind, not as horror but as release. The pressure eased when I imagined myself out there among them, letting go of the struggle, surrendering to the pull. That was the final betrayal. Whatever waited above didn't need force. It didn't need violence, it only needed us to look, to understand just enough to want it. I slid down to the floor, nails digging into my palms, and whispered to myself that this wasn't freedom, that nothing which demanded the erasure of fear and resistance could be salvation. But even as I said it, the melody pulsed warmly through my thoughts, and I knew the truth I was fighting against. Now that I'd seen what happened when you looked, part of me desperately wanted to look again. I knew then that willpower alone wouldn't be enough. Seeing them rise had changed something fundamental in me. The urge was no longer subtle or persuasive, it was ravenous. My body leaned toward doors and windows without permission, muscles tightening as if preparing to sprint. I caught myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, fingers curled around the railing, unsure how I'd gotten there. That scared me enough to act. I dragged the heaviest furniture I owned, wardrobes, shelves, a collapsed bookcase, and piled them against the stairs until the passage looked more like a barricade than a home. The pressure in my head responded immediately, spiking in sharp, furious bursts, and beneath it came something new: contempt. Not spoken aloud, not even fully formed as words, but unmistakable. A sense that I was being childish, that I was delaying the inevitable. My hands trembled as I worked, sweat slicking my palms, and every instinct screamed that I was hurting myself for no reason at all. When the barricade was finished, I went further because some part of me knew it still wouldn't be enough. I tied a rope around my waist and secured it to an exposed pipe in the basement wall, knotting it again and again until my fingers went numb. The voice, because by then it felt dishonest not to call it that, grew sharper, more focused. It laughed at me, not with sound, but with sensation. A cold amusement that crawled through my thoughts. Images flooded my mind of how easily I could free myself, of how pain was temporary and reward eternal. Time began to slip after that. Minutes stretched into hours, hours collapsed into nothing. I would blink and feel as though days had passed, only to realize the same song on the radio upstairs was still playing. Hunger came and went in waves, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes absent, as if my body were no longer operating on consistent rules. The worst moments were when the pressure softened. Those were the traps. During those lulls, the voice turned gentle again, almost affectionate, mocking my efforts with quiet patience. "Look at you," it seemed to say, "hurting yourself just to stay small." I felt it watching me struggle against the rope, felt its satisfaction when my muscles burned and failed. Once, in a moment of weakness, I struck my leg hard against the concrete wall just to remind myself that pain still belonged to me. The agony was blinding, white-hot, and for a brief, blessed moment the pressure receded entirely. I sobbed with relief, even as nausea churned in my stomach. The voice recoiled, then returned, colder than before, flooding me with images of stepping outside and never feeling pain again. It promised rest, it promised silence, it promised that I wouldn't have to fight myself anymore. I don't know how many days passed like that. The basement had no windows, and the light bulbs flickered unpredictably, sometimes plunging me into darkness for what felt like hours. My thoughts grew sluggish, fragmented, slipping away from me mid-sentence. I started speaking out loud just to hear something human, even if it was only my own voice. The voice inside me grew crueler as my strength faded, taunting me with how unnecessary this suffering was, how easily it could end. It showed me flashes of the sky again, vast, endless, waiting, and laughed when my body strained toward the stairs despite the rope biting into my waist. Staying inside was possible. I was living proof of that, but every moment of resistance cost me something I wasn't sure I could afford to lose. And deep down beneath the pain and fear, I understood the cruelest truth of all: whatever was calling to us didn't need to win. It only needed us to grow too tired to keep fighting. When I managed to pull myself back upstairs, dragging the rope behind me like a reminder of my own desperation, the first thing I did was turn on the television. I don't know what I expected. Sirens, emergency broadcasts, frantic anchors struggling to explain the impossible. But what I got was weather and traffic and a cheerful morning show laughing about a misplaced coffee mug. There was no mention of missing people, no reports of bodies rising into the sky, no footage of rain-soaked streets emptied overnight. I flipped through channels until my fingers cramped, heart pounding harder with each familiar ordinary image. When the local news finally appeared, the anchor smiled calmly and spoke about minor infrastructure issues in the region. My town's name appeared briefly at the bottom of the screen, followed by the word evacuated. No explanation beyond that. No urgency. Just a footnote. I stared at the screen, waiting for something to crack, for confusion, for disbelief. But the broadcast moved on without hesitation. Roads closed. Power disruptions. Temporary displacement. The language was neat. Sanitized, reassuring. It rewrote everything I'd seen into something manageable, something boring. My hands shook as I reached for my laptop, the pressure in my head throbbing in anticipation. I searched for videos, posts, anything that might prove I wasn't alone in remembering what had happened. At first, I thought I'd found something. A shaky clip, a comment thread full of half-formed panic. But when I clicked, the pages refreshed into errors. Posts vanished. Accounts no longer existed. Search results returned nothing but outdated articles and broken links. It was as if the internet itself had agreed to forget. With every failed attempt, the pressure eased slightly, like approval. The realization made my stomach churn. Whatever this was, it wasn't just inside us. It was larger than that. I tried calling numbers I still remembered, neighbors, friends, anyone, but most didn't connect. The few that did rang endlessly unanswered. I imagined empty houses, doors left ajar, radios playing to no one. The voice in my head hummed softly, satisfied, and I felt the weight of isolation settle over me like a physical thing. This wasn't an event the world would grapple with. There would be no investigation, no rescue, no explanation. It was being folded away, labeled, and dismissed before it could spread. That terrified me more than the thought of whatever waited above the sky. Erasure meant permanence. It meant this wasn't a mistake to be corrected. It was a process being completed. As the day wore on, I realized how thoroughly I'd been cut off. My town wasn't missing. It had been removed, a clean excision sealed over with language and bureaucracy. The pressure in my head pulsed steadily, no longer aggressive, no longer coaxing, just present, like a constant reminder of what I knew and what I wasn't supposed to share. I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by barricades and silence, and understood that isolation wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. With no witnesses, no records, no acknowledgement, resistance became a personal problem, a private madness. The world had moved on, smoothly and efficiently, and left me behind with the knowledge that reality itself could be edited. And once that happens, once the truth becomes inconvenient enough to delete, you're no longer fighting an invasion. You're fighting the certainty that no one is coming to help. I don't know how much time I have left. My body feels hollowed out, like whatever kept me upright has been slowly scooped away and replaced with this constant pressure, this presence that no longer bothers hiding its impatience. I'm recording this because writing has become too difficult, because my hands shake and my thoughts slip away before I can pin them down. If you're hearing this, then I've managed to hold on long enough to send it out into the world, and I need you to listen carefully. I am not strong anymore. Every breath feels borrowed. The urge to stand up, to walk to the door, to let this end the easy way is overwhelming. It feels less like temptation now and more like gravity. I understand finally why so many people stopped resisting. Fighting yourself is exhausting in a way nothing else can prepare you for. The pressure has learned me. It knows which memories weaken my resolve, which thoughts make my chest ache with longing. It wears my daughter's voice sometimes, not the wrong one from that phone call, but the real one, the one I remember from when she was younger and still laughed without restraint. It shows me the sky again, endlessly wide and waiting, and it promises that whatever is left of me won't hurt anymore if I just let go. I won't pretend I haven't considered it. I won't pretend that part of me doesn't crave the silence it offers. But there's something else beneath those promises, something cold and vast that doesn't care whether I'm relieved or terrified. I don't know what's up there. I can't describe it in words that make sense. I only know with a certainty deeper than fear that it is not salvation. If you're listening to this because you feel it too, because there's a pressure behind your eyes or a thought that keeps drifting toward the outdoors, you need to understand this. The relief is a lie. It's not peace, it's not freedom, it's surrender. Whatever waits above the sky doesn't want your happiness or your pain, it wants your participation. The people I saw rising weren't being rescued. They were being absorbed, folded into something so large it had no room for individuality, no concept of mercy. Their fear didn't stop it. Their hope didn't either. The song they sang wasn't joy or despair. It was alignment. And once you align with it, there is no coming back. Death would be kinder. Death ends. This doesn't. I can feel myself slipping as I say this. There are moments now when I forget why staying inside mattered, when the barricades look foolish and unnecessary. In those moments, I play this recording back to myself, listen to my own voice shake and strain, and I remember the struggle in their bodies as they rose. I remember the way the world erased them without hesitation. I remember that whatever this is thrives on quiet compliance, on people convincing themselves that nothing is wrong. Don't help it. Don't make its work easier. If no one else will tell you the truth, let me be the one who does, even if you never know my name. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if resisting changes anything beyond the length of my own suffering, but I do know this. As long as you stay inside, as long as you refuse to answer the call, some part of you remains yours. That matters more than comfort, more than relief, more than the promise of an eternity that was never meant for us. If the pressure is there, if the thought feels warm and reasonable and inevitable, that's when you need to be strongest. Lock your doors, close your curtains. Ignore the knocking, the singing, the certainty in your own mind telling you it's safe to step outside. I am weak now and I may not last much longer. But if this reaches you in time, then maybe my resistance wasn't meaningless. Please stay inside.